So now we're going to be talking about JavaScript and jQuery. So just as a recap, HTML is the language that your browser uses to define the content and structure of your page. JavaScript is the language you use to manipulate the content and make it interactive. But JavaScript is an actual programming language, unlike HTML and CSS. It's not just used for the front end, even though it was originally designed for that. We'll also be using it in the back end during our node lectures. So if you've never programmed before, there are a lot of concepts like functions, objects, arrays that you'll need to understand. So if you're not familiar with these terms, we suggest that you check out the Code Academy tutorial on JavaScript, which will take you from the beginning of programming concepts and introduce JavaScript syntax. If you need help with the tutorial or you just want to be walked through it, we'll be holding an office hours workshop tomorrow at 7 p.m. in the Static Basement. So if you already know Java, so show of hands, who's seen Java before or worked with it? Okay, so most people. So JavaScript has Java in the name, but they're actually largely unrelated. I think this story is something like when they first created JavaScript, Java was really popular. So they thought that if they put Java in the name, more people would use it. So they're actually very different, but syntactically, they look kind of similar. So if you look at if-else statements, you can see that it uses curly braces, it uses the same if-else syntax, it uses the paren around the condition is ready. The printing out looks different. It says console.log instead of system.out. It has semicolons at the end of each statement. So in JavaScript, if you accidentally leave out a semicolon, it actually won't complain to you. What a semicolon means in JavaScript is this is the end of this piece of code. Whereas in Java, if you try to compile it without a semicolon, it'll give you an error. In JavaScript, sometimes we get weird behavior where, for example, if the class console.log didn't have a semicolon under it, it would assume that whatever comes after it is part of the same piece of code. And in some cases, it would concatenate it and there would be a weird error. You can also notice that the isReady variable is declared as a var instead of a boolean, and we'll come back to that later. So for loops also look pretty similar. This is the syntax where you start with declaring your variable I. You declare different types of loops, like for each loops that also exist in JavaScript, and you can look those up. So where it starts to diverge from Java is in arrays and objects. So who's used Python before? Okay, so maybe a little less than Java, but still most people. So in Java, you have arrays and array lists, right? But in Python, you only have lists, which are essentially array lists. And this is the same for JavaScript. You just have lists. And this is how you would initialize a list or fill it. Objects in JavaScript are essentially equal to maps in Java and dictionaries in Python. So this is the syntax you use to declare an object in JavaScript. You have a key, which has to be a string, and you have a value, which can be any type. You can also set a value as a function on an object. And to access values within an object, you have these two ways on line 14 and 15. So you can use a period, or you can use this bracket notation. So in JavaScript, there's actually multiple ways to declare functions. In the first way, you have a named function called getFruitiness. And in the second way, you are declaring getFruitiness as a variable. And in this way, you can set it to an object. So for example, if you have this banana object, on line 6, you could do banana.getFruitiness equals function, or something like that. There's a few other ways that these two ways of declaring functions are different. It gets kind of complicated at high level, so you can look it up online for a more detailed write-up. So one of the most important differences between Java and JavaScript is that when you declare a variable, you write var in front of it instead of the type of the variable. This doesn't mean that variables don't still have types. So for example, isReady is still Boolean. Num loops and decimal are both numbers, so there's no differentiation between integers and floats in JavaScript, even though the concepts still exist. They're just a number type, and name is still a string. So because you don't declare the type of a variable when you initialize it, there's a bit of tricky semantics when you check for equality with variables. So usually in Java you would use equals equals to check if two things are equal, right? But in JavaScript, if you use equal equal, it will try to convert the type so that the two things you're comparing are the same type before comparing them. So like in the first example, the number 1 is equal to the string 1. And apparently, the string space, empty space, when you convert it to a Boolean, it evaluates the false. And this usually isn't the behavior that you want. So you want to always use triple equals, which doesn't perform the type conversion. It'll check that the type and the value are the same for your variables. So now that we know some basic JavaScript syntax, we want to use JavaScript to react to user input on your HTML page. You can also get or change HTML on the page. So these are the basic actions you can perform with JavaScript in order to make your page interactive. So when the user performs button clicks, when they type, when they move their mouse around the page and hover over divs, these are all things that you can react to in JavaScript to make your page interactive. You can add and remove divs on the page. You can get the div, you can get the text of an input box or of any element on the page. You can modify the CSS directly, or you can change things by adding or removing classes to change CSS properties. So similar to CSS, you want to embed the JavaScript in your HTML. So this takes place in the head of your HTML file. So one thing to note is that the head loads before the body. In CSS, this isn't as relevant because in CSS, you're just declaring a set of rules. But in JavaScript, you're accessing the actual content of the page. So for example, if you say, I want to access the div with class box, the head loads before the content inside the body tag of your HTML. So if you embed this example JS script in your head and you try to access the div with class box, that div doesn't actually exist yet because the body hasn't loaded yet. So one solution is to put your own custom code at the end of your body. So I think I'm actually missing this body here. Sorry about that. So usually a best practice is to load any libraries that you want to use. So these are external libraries like JQuery. So in Java, if you want to use ArrayList, you have to import that before you can use them. And in JavaScript, it's similar. If you want to use functions from libraries, you import them in your head, and then you load your own custom JavaScript, like this workshop starter file, at the end of your body. So it would come after this div class container. And another example is you can actually load JavaScript from external sources. So a lot of times libraries will be hosted by companies like Google on their own servers. And instead of downloading them to your own server, you can just directly put in the URL from the content distributor, and it'll load that for you. Oh yeah, so this was the slide that was really fun. So this is the example where you load the workshop starter script at the bottom of your body so that it loads after all of the content. This is another way to do it. So there's a function called document.ready, which basically just states when everything is loaded on the page, run these things. So this console.log ready won't run until all of the HTML already exists on your page. So now let's talk about jQuery. So you hear about jQuery a lot when people talk about JavaScript, and it's essentially a JavaScript library. So like the example I mentioned before with ArrayList, you need to import ArrayList before you can use it. Or in Python, something like you need to import the math library before you can use it. So jQuery essentially just gives you a lot of functions that overlap the functionality of JavaScript, but it's a lot cleaner to use, and usually it's a lot shorter, and it'll make your life easier. So for example, if you want to select HTML elements using CSS selectors. So this is the same syntax with dots for classes and pound signs for IDs. Without jQuery, you have to use this clunky syntax like document.querySelector or get elements by class. But with jQuery, you use this $, paren, and then the string that's the HTML selector. And basically, it will select all the elements with class box on the page, or all the elements that are P, or that are paragraphs. So the first example is an example of using a class selector. The second example is a tag selector. So notice that there's no dot or pound sign in front of it. It just means everything that has the tag P. The last example is the ID selector. So this is an example of manipulating HTML elements. So you can change how HTML elements look on the page by modifying the CSS. And jQuery has a lot of helper functions to help you with this. So there's the .show function, which modifies the display property. And it just does what you think it would. It shows the element. You can also have an option of putting some animation in when you show, like fading it in or sliding it in, something like that. You can set CSS properties directly, and you can remove elements from the HTML page. So on line 8, that will just find all of the elements with class box and delete them from your HTML. So in the examples earlier, you might have noticed there's this $sign. And it might look like something special, but it's actually just a string, like any other function name. And it's just short for the word jQuery. So if you have $sign front box, it's essentially the same as saying jQuery front box, but it makes things cleaner. So now that we know how to select elements on the page using jQuery, another important function is traversing through the elements on your page. And this is where the document object model that Monday mentioned earlier comes in. So who here has heard of a tree before? So not that many people. So I'm going to draw an example. So you have your window. And maybe you have this div with class content. And inside content, you have a login form. Is this too small? Can you guys read this? No. Try to write it bigger. So, So this box has class content. This inner box has class login form. And this other box has some other class, like info text or something. So in this example, when you select login box, it's going to select this box because this is the element with ID login box. When you use the jQuery function .parent, it looks for the parent element of the login box. So the parent element is the one that's directly, so login box is directly enclosed by its parent element. So in this case, it would be this outer box, content. So it has to do with how you're nesting your HTML elements. So in a tree format, it kind of looks like, so you have your window, which is the top level element. And then inside it, you have content. So this would actually be like your body, because your content div, all your divs are enclosed in your body, right? So content is a child of body. And inside content, you have the login box and the info text. So you would call login and info text to be siblings because they're children of the same parent. And so content is the parent of login and info text. And login is a child of content. So using this terminology, you can use jQuery functions to navigate the content on your page. So say you have an ID on login, but you don't have something that you can select content with. Say this is just a div, and you don't know how to use a selector to select it. You can actually just select login and say you want to access the parent of login, and it'll give you the div that encloses it. So in this example, so the first one, login box parent, would be content. Login box children, it actually has no children right now, but if there were divs inside of it, that's what it would return. And login box.next returns the immediately following sibling. So in login, or in the content div, you have login followed by info text. So this would return the info text div. It returns them as JQuery objects, which are essentially the same as HTML elements, but you can call JQuery functions on them. So this is useful for when you want to insert HTML onto the page, you want to know where you want to insert it. Or when you want to modify HTML, you want to know which div you're inserting it, or which div you're modifying. And so if you want to get some updates from the user or from your backend and then update the page, you're going to need to know how to directly put HTML into the page using JQuery. And these are just some examples of what you can do. So there are different functions for putting things inside of an element. So say you select a div, and you want to put text at the end of that div, but still inside the div. You would use append or prepend for the beginning of the div. And then before and after are for putting them directly before or after the div, but outside of the actual div tags. And there's a lot of functions like this. You can just look up the jQuery documentation for those. HTML is for setting the HTML content of a div, and it's for when you want to actually set something with HTML tags in it. If you're just setting text, it's usually bad practice to use .html because if it's something that you're getting from a user, they could maliciously put different HTML tags in it, and your page would actually process those tags and display them. So you want to use .text because it'll escape special characters like HTML tags. And the last example is just how you would create a HTML element using jQuery. So you have this $, so it looks a lot like when you're selecting something, but instead of using a CSS selector, you use an HTML tag, and it's just the opening tag. So what this does, it creates a new jQuery object that's a div. And then you can set attributes on it, so like ID, and you can add classes and IDs. So somewhere you would want to use this is if you're directly inserting a big chunk of HTML into your page. You don't want to use this giant HTML string because for one, it's really ugly in your JavaScript file. It makes it really messy. It's also really easy to make typos. Like if you're missing an HTML angle bracket somewhere, it's just going to break. And if you want to insert variables in it, it's kind of clunky to keep doing this, ending the string, and then adding my title, and then starting the string again. So what you can do is create jQuery elements. Like sign up header is a div, and then you can actually chain HTML functions on each other. So once you create the div, you add the class myHeader, and then you create this h1 element, and you add text, you add a title, you create the paragraph element, and at the very end, you append the h1 head and the paragraph to your header. So in this way, you can build up your HTML using jQuery objects, and at the very end, append it to your HTML. So now let's talk about how you would react to a user action. So different types of user actions are called events in jQuery. You can look it up online. There's this huge list of different events a user can make. Some examples are like click, drag, focus. Focus is like when you click inside an input box, and that little blinking line comes up. That's when you focus. A key press, so like when you press a keyboard, and when you mouse over, so like hover over a div, there's actually a mouse enter option. When you enter the div, and a mouse leave option. So let's say you want to do this action, you want to do this reaction. When a user clicks a certain button, you want to print yay to the console. So first, you want to define a function in JavaScript that prints yay, and this is just your function. And second, you're going to say, when I hear the click event on this button, so in jQuery, you want to select the button first using this ID selector, and then you say .on, and that's just a jQuery function for setting event listeners. So when you're listening for an event. And then click is the name of the event that you're listening to. And you say, when the event happens, run this function. So you pass the function cheer in. So you can actually pass functions like objects in JavaScript, and we'll come back to this later. This is called a callback function. So you're saying, when this click event happens, get back to me and call this function. You can also pass in an anonymous function. So this is when you don't define the cheer function that prints EA separately. You just put it directly in as a parameter to the on function, and you don't give it a name. So in this case, you wouldn't be able to access this function again later because you're not naming it. It just kind of disappears. But if you don't want to reuse this function, you can just pass it in directly. So callback functions can run either synchronously or asynchronously. So if it runs synchronously, you're following the main logic flow from function to function. So you run your JavaScript code in order. If it runs asynchronously, it'll happen outside of the main logic flow, and it uses something called the event loop model. So here's an example. Say you're printing out this count, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Except you also want this event listener to be there. So when a button is clicked, you want someone, when someone clicks on the button, you want to print yay. So you don't want to interrupt your printing out of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You don't want to sit there waiting for the user to click the button and then continue, right? Because JavaScript is running in order. So what happens essentially is you send a message to your browser that says, watch for the click event on my button. When that happens, send me back a message. And you have this mailbox that the browser is going to send like these event messages into. And in the background, as you run these like print 1, 2, 3, 4, your browser is constantly watching that mailbox for new messages. If it sees a message that says, oh, the click event happened on this button, it's going to process that message and run the function that prints EA. And it does this outside of the logic that prints 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in order. So it lets you not wait for these things to happen. So for example, if you make a call to your backend and you're waiting for it to come back over the internet, you don't have to wait. You can just continue with your JavaScript, and it'll happen by itself when it gets back to you. So like I said before, in JavaScript, you can pass functions like objects. And this is another difference from Java. So for example, you have this function called addSmiley that just takes input text and then appends a smiley face to it. And you have this function called foo that takes in a function. It prints running, and then it runs the function that it takes in. And it passes in a parameter, I'm done. So you notice that you can actually just use callback. Callback is a variable that refers to whatever function that you're passing. First you print hello, then you call foo and pass in the addSmiley function. So that means foo is going to print running, and then it's going to run the addSmiley function and pass in I'm done as the input text. So first you define the function, you take the function as a parameter, you call it, and this is the end output. So first you print hello, then you print running because foo on line 7 prints running first, and then it calls addSmiley on line 9, which prints I'm done and adds a smiley to it, and then you get to the end. So now let's talk about scoping. You might have noticed that you declare variables with the var keyword. So when you declare a variable with var, it's saying this is a new variable. When you declare a variable without var, normally in Java, it would complain if you don't set the type of your new variable. However, in JavaScript, what it actually does is it checks, usually when you declare a variable without var, you're saying use this variable that already exists. What it does in JavaScript is first it checks if this variable actually already exists. And if it doesn't already exist, it'll create a new variable in the global scope. So to understand that, we have to talk about scoping. So how scoping works is kind of like the context of your function. So I guess as an example, we have this window. So when you, can everyone read this box, by the way? I realize it's kind of small. Yeah, it says window. So when you have a function in your JavaScript file, so this is just at the top level of your JavaScript file, it's not nested inside any other function, you're actually attaching this function to a window object. So in your window object, and this is the top level of your JavaScript file, there's no nesting. You can declare variables. So we have this variable count equals 100, and this is called a global variable. because at this top level is your global scope. So attached to your window object in the global scope, you also have this getFruit function and this getInput function. So now you know you have this count variable and you have these two functions. And you don't know if you have any other variables. These are the only ones you can see from the global scope of the window. But inside each of these functions, they actually have their own variables. So here you declare var new fruit equals apple inside getFruit. So this is what's called a local scope. Each function is like a closed box. It has its own local scope, and window can't see inside of it. But since getFruit is inside of window, it can actually see all the variables inside window. So getFruit can access count, and it can access new fruit. So now let's check inside getInput. So inside getInput, we have var new text equals hi. And we have this function, getChanges. It's really small. So this function, getInput, is aware of these two variables, and it's aware of the count variable, because it's nested inside the window. However, it's not aware of the variable inside getFruit. It can't access local variables inside getFruit's scope. So this is kind of similar to the tree model I was talking about earlier. You have these functions that are nested. You can access, when you think about scope, you can kind of think of it as you can access variables in kind of like your parent functions, right? So if you're nested inside of a function, you can look up at your parent and access those variables, but you can't look down. And you also can't look at your siblings. So in this example, getInput and getFruit would be kind of like siblings. And they can't see inside each other because they're not nested inside each other. So when you use the var keyword, you're creating a new variable inside the scope of your current function. When you don't use the var keyword, JavaScript actually does something different. So say you have this count variable inside window, but then you say count equals 100 inside getInput. So what it first does, it checks if count exists in the set of variables that getInput is aware of. And because getInput can access Windows variables, it sees that there's a count variable here already, and it'll use that one and change it. However, if you have new text inside of getInput, this is local to getInput scope. If you want to say new text equals hi inside of getFruit, so you have this line, you don't use the var inside getFruit. getFruit can't see the var new text inside of this other function. So what it'll do is, first it checks to see if it can find a variable called this, and it doesn't. So it actually creates a new variable called new text. And usually you don't want this behavior. So you want to always put var when you're declaring a new variable, and only leave it out if you're setting a variable. I'll put that up later. So this is also relevant to something called the this keyword. So this is a special variable in JavaScript. And what it refers to actually changes depending on the context in which you're using it. So the exact semantics of this is kind of complicated. There's a lot of different behaviors and edge cases, and it would take an entire lecture to explain all of them. But basically, you want to understand that it essentially depends on the context in which you're calling a function, not the context in which you define a function. Because you can first define a function and then call it later somewhere else. So for example, if you have this print width function and you log this.innerWidth, if print width is at the top level of your JavaScript file, it's attached to this window object. So this refers to window when you call print width. And it'll print the window's width. But if you have this callback function on a button, when the callback function runs, when print width runs, this will refer to the button on which the click event happened. So it'll actually print the button's width. So to get around this, you want to save this variable if you really need to use it. So in the top function, you log this.color, and then you have a callback function. So there's usually, this changing of what this refers to usually happens when you have a lot of nested functions, right? So you have this callback function, and you want to log this.color. Except when this callback actually happens, this is going to refer to fruit button, and not the same thing as what this referred to before, outside of the event listener. So to get around this, in the second example, you save this to the variable fruit. So this, because it's a special word in JavaScript, it's going to change. But if you save it to fruit, fruit is a variable that you define, so that's not going to change. So if you console.log fruit color outside of this event listener, it's going to print out the fruit's color. If you console.log fruit.color inside of the callback function, it'll still print out the same fruit color. So a lot of times in examples or tutorials, it'll say to save this to that, and that's just another way to refer to it. So basically, you just want to be careful if you're using the keyword this. A lot of times, it's not going to refer to what you think it does. If you start getting weird bugs when you're using this, make sure you print out this and check what it is. So just as a recap, JavaScript syntax is a lot like Java. If you've used Java and Python before, you can basically already just do JavaScript and look up some examples of functions. But they're different in some key concepts. JQuery is a JavaScript library that overlaps the functionality of JavaScript, but makes it prettier and simpler and easy to use. You want to embed your JavaScript in your HTML, but make sure that you wait for the content on your page to be loaded before you start modifying it. And you can use JavaScript to modify HTML elements and react to user input. So now let's do a workshop. So go to this, so the first URL is the instructions. The second URL is a GitHub repository that you're going to clone. So here are some hints while you're working on the workshop. If there's something that you want to do with JavaScript or jQuery and you don't know how to do it, you can usually just Google, like say, I want to show this button with a fade-in animation. Literally just Google like JavaScript jQuery, show button with fade animation. And a lot of times you'll find a Stack Overflow answer that tells you exactly how to do it. Sometimes you might have to sit through like people who write super long answers that aren't relevant. Who here has used the Chrome inspector before? Okay, so some people. So if you go to a Chrome page, so we recommend that you use Chrome. There's also ways to do this in other browsers, but I haven't used them personally, so I'm not as familiar with them. So if you go to a page in Chrome, and you want to see, like you have some paragraph, and you want to see if there's a class on that paragraph, you right-click the content on the page, and you go to Inspect on the drop-down menu. And this opens basically a new frame in your browser that'll show you the HTML content. It'll directly navigate to where in the HTML the element that you clicked on exists. It shows you the CSS styles that are on that piece of HTML. And it also opens up the Chrome console. So if you haven't used the inspector before, the default view should show all of these things. Sometimes some of these things are hidden. So if you're having trouble finding either the console or where the HTML is or where the CSS is, you can raise your hand and one of us will help you. So this is helpful when you want to modify an element on a page, but you don't know what to select it with. You don't know if it has an ID or a class, and you don't have access to the HTML yourself. So in this case, you do have access to the HTML, but it'll help you to go side by side and kind of look at the example when you open the HTML page and look at the HTML code. And we'll be going over how to use the Chrome inspector in more detail during the debugging your approaches lecture on Thursday. So I'll give you like 10-ish minutes to work on this, and then we'll come back and go through each example on the projector. So change the font color of fruity website to purple. So you look for fruity website, it's this text here, and you see that it's an H1 element with the class title. So you want to use a selector to select something with the class title. And in this case, it's the only thing with the class title. So you know it's what you want to get. And we're going to change the font color to purple. So you can change the CSS property color to purple. And you want to make sure you have these quotation marks to indicate that it's a string. So let's check that. Looks like it. I had the wrong thing open. So this is in okay, now it's working. Cool. So exercise 2. So apologies about this exercise. I forgot that when you hide a div, it kind of goes away. So like the behavior is a little strange depending on what you use to show or hide it. So basically, you want to select the random white div. And put an event listener on it. So the events that I used were mouse enter and mouse leave because they detect entering and leaving separately. I think some people also used hover and got similar behavior. So all these events kind of like behave a little bit differently, and you can look up the exact semantics online. So I did mouse enter, and you pass in the callback function, which is anonymous. So some people were a bit confused about like what this function word means. So if you programmed in Python, it's essentially the same as the word def, right? It's just declaring that you're like creating a new function. In JavaScript, it's the same as saying like public void blah blah blah. It's like the syntax that you use to declare a new function. So on mouse enter, you want to hide it, and as you might have found when you looked it up, this hide function in JQuery can take parameters for different things like animating, waiting a certain period of time before animating, and here we're just going to say slow, which will give it like a certain animation. And then on mouse leave, so now let's test this. So it'll like go away and then come right back. And like, yeah, I should have written this workshop better, so apologies for that. I forgot that it would go away and then come back automatically. But this is basically what it's supposed to do. And there's actually like multiple ways to do it. And it's just kind of an example of when you want to do like a certain event in jQuery, there isn't always like one set way to do it. You could also have done this with like CSS transitions. You could do it with like different events or different jQuery functions. So exercise 3. So wait, how many people actually got to exercise 3 again? Okay, so like a little bit less than half, I think. Oh, sorry. So exercise 3, we didn't cover completely during the lecture, so you might have had to Google some stuff yourself. So first, you want to put an event listener on the input box, or on the go button, to detect when a user clicks the go button, right? So let's see, the go button is a button tag. So you want to select the button tag. So like this, if you put in a selector that doesn't have a dot or a hash in front of it, it means you're selecting everything with the button tag. And then you listen for the click event, and you pass in the function. So when a user clicks the go button, you want to get the text from the input box and display it in the white div. So in order to get the text from the input box, this is something that you could just Google. Like you can just search like JavaScript, get text from input box, and you'll find that you want to select the input and then get the .val, right? And we're going to save it to a variable. And now we want to put it inside the white div. So we're going to select the white div, and you're going to say .text is input text. So again, like we mentioned before, you want to use .text when you're setting the text div. Otherwise, if the user inputs something like that has HTML text in it, your browser is actually going to like parse that HTML and display the HTML. And this can lead to some unintended side effects, like the user can input like script tags, like a JavaScript tag, and just put like evil JavaScript in your web page, which you don't want. So we're gonna test this. And now it displays it. Oh, and it hit. But yeah, it displays it like, yay. So I'll put up a solutions repo later, and it'll be linked somewhere on either the lecture page or the instruction page for the workshop. And we'll have a council note about it. So on Thursday, we're going to talk about the other main functions of JavaScript in the front end, which is to communicate with your back end and to send and receive data across the web. And this is using something called AJAX, and it's something called HTTP calls, which you'll learn about tomorrow during the preface to back end lecture. Just as a reminder, tomorrow at midnight is the milestone 0 deadline. So if you haven't formed teams already, you can come down to the front like yesterday. Just look for other people who are looking for team members. You don't have to have all 3 people. You can have a team of 2 or just 1. For milestone 0, you want to submit your team, have your GitHub set up, to set up your SSH keys like yesterday's workshop, and you want to submit 10 ideas that follow the theme. And you don't have to use one of these 10 ideas. This is just to get you started on ideating. And later on for the next milestone, you're going to take an idea that's not necessarily one of these, and you're going to pitch it to us.